The second reading debate in the House of Lords on the assisted suicide bill has ended, and the Lords have voted to refer the bill to a select committee to consider it further. There are a number of things to consider about this. First of all, the constitutional position. Is it right for the House of Lords, the unelected House, to overturn or delay the decision of the elected democratic chamber? Well, yes and no. The yes bit is that this was not a manifesto commitment. No party said that they wanted to bring forward assisted suicide as part of their programme, and it was a free vote in the House of Commons. I feel strongly that the House of Lords should allow the elected assembly to get its way in normal circumstances. This is how government operates. The Lords are there as a revising chamber rather than as a primary chamber. And even when it's a Labour government, I don't believe that their lordships should frustrate the basic thrust of what the government is trying to do, and that the Salisbury-Addison Convention that maintains that on a second and third reading their lordships will allow through a manifesto commitment remains absolutely right. But in my view, it goes further than that the Lords should routinely allow the elected government of the day to get its business. And this is irrespective of the share of the vote. We all know that Labour only got 33% of the vote, but the Lords must be responsive to the House of Commons majority, not to the share of the vote. That, in a way, isn't its business. The consequences of the electoral system are not the business of the House of Lords. But then you come to private members' bills. Private members' bills are different. They're different in the Commons and they're different in the Lords. In the Commons, it is possible to delay private members' bills because they don't have that mandate of a general election victory behind them. They are an idea of a member of parliament rather than being something that is part of the government's programme. It is why you can still talk out private members' bills, why that commonly happens, why there are not guillotines on the proceedings within private members' bills. They are still, of course, public bills, but they don't have the same ability to be timetabled and pushed through in the Commons as government bills do. Thus, when they get to the House of Lords, they are not part of the government's democratic mandate. And it's worth bearing in mind that with an issue as sensitive as assisted suicide, members haven't voted on a party ticket. They have voted on their own conscience. Now, we of course have a representative government, and your Member of Parliament, as Burke famously said, owes you his judgment as well as his industry. And it is quite reasonable that MPs should vote according to their conscience. But that has a lesser democratic mandate than something that comes from the party that they stand for, because almost all votes in the general election, almost all, are cast on the basis of what the parties and the party leaders stand for, not on the private ethics of the individual Member of Parliament. These are a secondary or tertiary consideration for most voters. So there's no mandate for the individual MPs' individual ethical views. Thus, when it gets to the House of Lords, it's not the unelected House against the elected House. It is two groups of people with both having a degree of validity who are expressing their moral ethics. Thus, the Lords is absolutely entitled to consider with great care what the House of Commons has sent to it. And if the House of Commons persists, then of course the Parliament Act is available, and the Commons would be able to get its way if there were sufficient support for that. Thus, it is clear that the House of Lords has the right to do what it's doing, and the Commons does have the means to override it if that is the will of the Democratic House in the end. But the Lords has more latitude with a private member's bill than with a government bill. But let's move on to the fundamental principle underlying the suicide bill. And first of all, it is suicide. It's really interesting that the proponents of the bill are so sensitive about the language. They want to call it assisted dying because they're ashamed of what they're trying to do. They are ashamed of the effort to allow people to kill themselves. Suicide still maintains a feeling of something that is wrong and ought to be avoided. And so they try and cheat with language effectively as a spin operation. And it's no surprise that in the House of Lords, the greatest proponent of the bill, Lord Faulkner, is an old friend of Tony Blair's, that absolute master of spin. He's clearly learned from the Prime Minister who he formerly served. Suicide is something that is taboo, whereas death is something that comes to us all. But giving people the means to kill themselves in any normal use of language is suicide. And that's an important point to remember, that the proponents of the bill are trying to get away from the unpleasant fact of what they are proposing. But it also undermines the sanctity of life. And why should we care about that? Some people say, oh, these religious fanatics, people like me, don't count. Their views should be put at a discount because they're inspired by something otherworldly. But so is our whole constitution. The truth is that we are a Christian nation and our laws are based on the teachings of Christ. And one of those that is absolutely clear and fundamental, is that life is sacred. We are created in the image and likeness of God. And that life that comes from God is his property, not our property. And that's why English law, British law, UK law has always been in favour of maintaining life. Murder is illegal under the common law, that even in Anglo-Saxon times, even in more brutal societies, murder was something that was clearly prohibited. Life has always been protected, and when we had capital punishment, there were always procedures that had to be gone through very carefully, and the prerogative of mercy rested with the Crown to save people from that ultimate penalty, which of course we abolished in a more civilized society. So the sanctity of life is important, and it underpins the society in which we live. And allowing the state to kill once again, which has been illegal since capital punishment was abolished, is a fundamental change in our relationship with the state. That the state that we thought was there to protect us, to succour us, to help us in our hour of need, is now there to say, you're a burden. Isn't it time that your life were brought to a close? Here is a structure that will allow it to happen. One of the most sinister parts of the bill is that people who lack mental capacity may have an advocate appointed for them, an advocate who can call for them to be killed. This is a really shocking thing to do, and we've seen with some court cases how the courts have not allowed parents to safeguard their children, sometimes children who have lived much longer than the courts anticipated. And now we're proposing that the state will provide advocates for death for those who don't have the capacity to make the decision for themselves. That's not suicide anymore. That is actively killing, and the state actively killing. It is a change in our relationship with the medical profession. The medical profession that is there to do no harm will now carry out active harm. It will be encouraged. It will be, in some cases, almost obliged to end people's lives rather than comforting as the hour of their death draws near. And it also assumes that the experts know much more than in reality they do. That the prediction of death is not a precise science. Some people are predicted to live for only 6 more months and live for years. Some people are told they have 6 months more to live and die the next day. The experts, the doctors, the physicians simply don't know with enough certainty what is happening with terminal illness to know when somebody will die, to justify preempting a higher authority deciding when our time on earth shall end. But it's not just about that. It's about the experience in other countries where the introduction of assisted suicide for the hardest, the saddest, the most painful cases then becomes more general. It becomes for other things, for minor problems and ailments, indeed even for mental health, and then even for children who are going through perhaps a momentary sadness, who have the whole of life before them in physical fitness and physical health, but who are to be killed. This is really a tragic way of approaching life, and one of the worst speeches in the House of Lords talked about population control and not worrying about these deaths when the population had expanded so much. This is a really terrible thing to say, that just because there are many people alive today does not mean that your life or my life or any other individual life in this country or abroad is less valuable, less somebody created in the image of God than was true when the population was much smaller. Using euthanasia, using assisted suicide, a means of population control, is almost unspeakably bad. It is not the sort of thing you would expect to hear in a parliament in the United Kingdom. And it's this ungodliness that underpins the desire to have assisted suicide that we should so worry about, that sees human life not as something precious, but as something ultimately utilitarian, and that our lives are there to be disposed of by the state rather than by ourselves. What do I mean by that? Well, each of us is at different periods in our life a cost to the state, a burden to the state, and a benefit to the state. A child is born, very often in an NHS hospital. That is a cost. A child goes to nursery school, a child goes to primary school, a child goes to secondary school, a child, becoming now a young adult, goes on to university. Through all those years, that child is likely to be a cost to the state rather than a contributor. Having left university, the person now enters into work, and in work becomes a contributor, pays taxes, is doing a job that adds to productivity, helps other people into employment, and that remains, attaching the costs of childhood to the child rather than to the parents, until that person retires. At the point of retirement, once again, the individual becomes a cost to the state. Some may say a burden to the state. People with disabilities may be a cost to the state throughout their whole lives. And then towards the end of their life, they become the biggest cost of all, because that is when people need the most medical care, the greatest intervention. But that is obviously, to some, an inconvenience, an embarrassment, something that should be stopped. And that is where assisted suicide is so terrifying, because it changes people from being the masters of the state to being its servants. And when they cease to be convenient to it, they cease to be an asset for it. The child is an asset because it will produce something later. The old person is not, and therefore the old person may be disposed of. It is not a utilitarian view of human nature, and this is where the pressure comes in. There will be pressure from rapacious relations who want their inheritance earlier, but the biggest pressure won't come from families. It will come from the individuals themselves. A pressure currently that they cannot apply to themselves, a pressure currently that doesn't exist, the law doesn't allow for. But many old people worry that they are a burden on their families and a burden on the NHS. We all know old people who don't like to ring the doctor because they feel that it's a burden to do so. Even people who've contributed so much to society during their lives, and that if they feel they are a burden, that they could end that burden by asking to be killed, they may feel that their moral obligation is not to live but to die. And then we will find that elderly people in nursing homes are effectively culled by a cruel society that puts the utilitarian convenience of the state above the fundamental principle of life. This is a terrible tragedy. The bill is a really very bad bill. It is one of the worst bills that I can think of that has come to Parliament. But it is part of the cult of death that exists within our society today, stalks the land in its way. I thought the week when the House of Commons passed this death bill, and it also voted that babies could be aborted by their mothers up until full term without any criminal consequence, was a black week in British society and in British history. Why? Because it turns against life. It doesn't value life. It doesn't believe life is important. It thinks that the interests of the state, for want of a better term, the interests of the selfish are better than the interests of the individual. And I just think that is fundamentally wrong. Life is the most precious gift of all. Of course people should be well looked after. Of course people in their failing years should be given all the treatments that are available. Of course, pain should be ameliorated. And if ameliorating pain shortens life, that is very different from forcefully deciding to end it by killing people who are seeing themselves or are seen by the nation as a burden. So it's good news what the House of Lords has done. It is good news that this will be referred to a select committee. I hope that this bill will never actually see the light of day. I hope it will never pass. It changes our society altogether, and it chooses evil rather than good. I hope it fails today as a good sign, today as an optimistic sign. And I think, interestingly, as we discuss it more, people begin to see how risky it is, how dangerous it is, that the mood of the nation, which when first asked, do you want to ease the end of people in pain, says yes, suddenly realises the full dangers of allowing a state, allowing doctors, allowing physicians to kill.